really delighted to be able to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Dina Borzekowski. So Dina is currently an associate professor in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society. And her key words, if you will, for her sort of research interests are children, media, and health. So she's looking at kids' sort of positive and negative perceptions around health of media messages, looking at media in terms of print, internet, radio, TV, and in kids, looking at all ages from preschoolers to elementary schoolers to teens. So sort of everything in that sort of bucket of media, kids, and health she has worked on. And I'm also very pleased to be able to say that she's moving on with a promotion to a full professor at the University of Maryland in their School of Public Health, which is, sad that she's leaving, but I'm happy that we'll be able to continue to collaborate because she's done great work, and she's going to talk to us today about one of the recent studies that she's conducted on kids related to tobacco, and I'll let you say the rest.
Great.
So welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This is going to be a lot of fun today. There are going to be some quizzes, so I hope you're up on your pop culture and your logos and such. And I'm going to tell you about a study that I worked on for the last 2 years or so, 2-3 years. And I think I'm supposed to be trapped by this podium, so I apologize that I'm not going to be moving around too much. So this study, the title of the talk is a 6-country study of young children's awareness of tobacco products and packaging. And let me start off with some acknowledgments. First, Joanna has been fantastic. This research was supported by a grant for the Institute, from the Institute for Global Tobacco Control with funding from the Bloomberg Initiative to Reduce Tobacco Use. The center's been fantastic. The Institute's been really, really supportive. The staff, Joanna leads around the world. I really could not have done this without a huge network of great people. Now, many of them are international. So I'm going to talk about I'm acknowledging my international collaborators. And I also got some local assistance from some staff and some students here. And we're going to continue to work on this project because, boy, do we have a lot of data. So there's a range in age in the room, but I'm going to guess that most of you know who this is. Who is it? Joe? Joe Cool, Joe Camel. Now, Joe Camel was around in the 80s and 90s. Big phallic camel face that, was the coolest guy out there, smoking his cigarettes. And as an animated character, it's not a big surprise that he sort of was, kids found him kind of cool. But to not only make him just the print and billboards of seeing his lovely face all over there, and he'd often be, hanging out with buxom, scantily clad women. What that camel was doing, I'm not sure, but often he was like playing pool, he was at sporting events. But to make it even more enticing, does anyone remember what this was? Really? So this is called Camel Cash. And it would come in cigarette packages as well as associated product with cigarettes. And kids would collect these. And you could trade them in for T-shirts and caps and all sorts of fun doodads. Now, who are we trying to attract when we have, things like this? Kids, right? Well, it wasn't until a study was done by Paul Fisher that this really became big news. So Paul Fisher did a study out of preschools outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in Augusta and Atlanta, Georgia. This study was published in 1991, and it looked at whether or not kids could recognize Joe Camel. And what he did, which was pretty clever, was he made it a comparison study. So he had kids look at a lot of logos, and he looked at children's brands, and he looked at their recognition. And it's a little tight here, but so the Disney Channel, among all the 3 to 6-year-olds, kids could recognize Mickey Mouse at a rate of 91.7%. 91.7% of the kids knew who Mickey Mouse was. 81% could identify McDonald's. 79% could identify Burger King. Among the cigarette brands, though, in the whole sample of 3 to 6-year-olds, around 51 could recognize Old Joe. 32.8 could recognize Marlboro. So what was going on here was kids were asked to identify these logos, and we were seeing these percentages. Now, in the whole sample of 3 to 6-year-olds, you saw a much higher rate for some of the Disney Channel things. But when he went down and he looked at different age groups, he found that there was no significant difference between kids' awareness of Mickey Mouse and Joe Camel. That was huge news. 6-year-olds, because the headlines were basically 6-year-olds can identify Joe Camel as much as they can do Mickey Mouse. Now, we know that there's a link. I'm not about to walk, but okay. Who's the guy in the middle? Okay, so you're a Team Edward person? Okay, so we know that when celebrities smoke, when kids are exposed to tobacco advertisements through billboards, when they're exposed to tobacco advertisements through magazines, who's the guy on the bottom? This is probably the older people. Brad Pitt. We know that when kids are more aware of celebrity smoking, of ads in magazines and billboards, that they are more likely to be tobacco users later in life. There's a great study that was done by DeFranza that was published in Pediatrics in 2006. And what they did was they looked at all of the literature. Now, interestingly, most of it's in the United States. But they looked at the literature, and they found that, 1, children are exposed to tobacco promotion before they initiate tobacco use. So little kids are exposed to this. Exposure increases the risk for initiation. There's a dose-response effect. So the more of this you're aware of, the more likely you're going to initiate smoking. And the increased risk is robust. It's been observed in multiple studies with different populations and different types of promotion. It persists after controlling for other factors. So we have great literature here that's showing kids who are exposed to tobacco marketing and advertising through celebrities are more likely to smoke themselves at a young age. This was big news in the 90s and such in the States. So much so that there's been a huge deal of regulation of advertisements and promotions. Now, some of these things we still have, Team Edward smoking, and Brad Pitt has quit smoking, by the way. Although I don't know if that's public knowledge. But things have changed in the United States. You guys didn't know what Camel Cash was, which is great. Joe Camel does not exist in the United States. So the question is, where did he go? Well, we know that rates around the world for smoking, especially in developing and transitioning countries, are increasing. This is a world map showing male smoking by country based on the WHO report on the global tobacco epidemic. In Russia, men are smoking, 60% of men are smoking or more. The rates are just as high in places like Indonesia and many of the other countries that Bloomberg is looking at. So in devising this study, we had this question of, we know Joe Camel's not in the United States, but where did he go? So we set out around 3 years ago, to do a study looking at small children's awareness of brand logos, cigarette logos, and the first thing we did was we looked at how the World Health Organization divides the world. And what we did was we looked at low and middle income countries, and we selected the countries where we saw the highest smoking prevalence rates, which resulted in a 6-country study that was done in China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Brazil. Here are the adult prevalence rates that we know based on national samples of men and women in these different countries. So again, you could see in Russia, the rate of smoking, the prevalence rate for men is over 60%. In China, it's around 53%. It's also, we looked at tobacco use and smoking. Rates are very high in Pakistan, in India, Brazil, and the Nigerian one is sort of a hard one to get at. There's not great research on national levels there. We're sort of seeing what's going on in more of the urban areas there. Consistently, men smoke more than women in these countries. So we decided to set out and do this study. Lots of fun trying to get IRB clearance in all of these countries. But through the Institute and connections, we worked to find really great partners in these countries. And we began working on our instruments. Doing research with the little ones is so much fun. I highly recommend it. If you ever get a chance to work with 5- and 6-year-old, that's the good stuff. So we put in some really kid-friendly measures. Let me show you one of them. This is from China. This was a measure we used to look at media exposure. Because one of the things that we wanted to look at was, well, is there awareness of brands associated with their media exposure? There's some funny stories to tell, or not so funny stories to tell. So this is a character card from China. We basically would sit on the floor with the kids and say, okay, name each one. I love this measure. It's so much better than asking a 5-year-old, how much television did you watch yesterday? Okay, let's ask, a 30-year-old in this room, how much television did you watch yesterday? What do you count as television? Do you count those YouTube videos that you were sent links? Do you just count when you walked into a room? Did you not get? So people have been studying media exposure, and they often ask, how much time did you spend yesterday? The cruddy measure. This is working really well. Now, so not only do we get a score, we know low, medium, high levels of exposure. You also, if you look at character CH07 as well as CH09, you can put in foils. And Joanna heard these stories when they happened. When you find out from your sample that a very high percentage can identify either CH07 or CH09, which are complete foils. Now, CH07 is my youngest daughter, and CH09 was a character I created named Terry. I pulled an animated picture and named him myself. So when your sample can identify him, then you get to go back and redo your data collection with a whole new team. Anyway, it's a fun way to do this. Another measure we used was looking at kids' perceptions of smoking. Well, how do you get at that? So what we did was we created a picture card, and we started at the top, and we said, this is a non-smoker, and this is a person who smokes cigarettes. Same person, right? And in fact, actually, this was a graduate student who was from Russia here at the School of Public Health. We took his photograph wearing this, he had to wear the same clothing, and he had to pretend to be using a cigarette. I think actually this one was a smoker. And then we said, okay, you have none, you have A, you have B, and then you have both of them. So if you would ask a question to try to assess kids' perception of how successful smokers are, we had a question that said, so who has a car? Which person has a car? So if a 5-year-old looks at this and says, well, neither of them have a car, then they would have picked the blank. If they picked the person who doesn't smoke, then that would have been A. If they picked the smoker, it's B. And if they picked both, it would be A and B. So you can assess what attributes they're giving to smoking behavior. So we looked at has a car, is smart, got in trouble with the police, is a leader in the community. So we could look at what are their attitudes about smoking among 5 and 6-year-olds. By the way, we did this for in each country. We had a person from that country, and we had a man, and we had a woman. We also looked at kids' intentions to smoke. Basically had a check mark and a no, and we used local symbols for yes versus no. And we started off with all sorts of questions. We had warm-up questions like, when you grow up, will you be a tree? And then we'd laugh about it, and we'd point to the no. And the kids would point very well. Most 5 and 6-year-olds are very aware they're not going to be trees when they grow up. But you could say, is going to have a good job, is going to get married. Although, by the way, in Pakistan, they wouldn't let us ask the question, will you be a mother or a father? They didn't like that question. They also made us remove the alcohol question from Pakistan. But amongst these things of when you grow up, will you have a nice car? Will you have a house? We did throw in the question, when you grow up, will you smoke cigarettes? So that's how we measured intentions to smoke. Then we had to go to the process of measuring, yeah. We had the picture, and then we had the word yes, and we had the word no. And we actually went through, this is yes, this is no, and we made sure the kids were very aware of the instruments. But then we had to go off and try to figure out how do they know logos. So let me go to this quiz. Let's have a little thing here and see how good you guys are. Okay? So this has been one of the latest crazes on the internet. People will play logo quiz games. So we're going to play one. Okay, call out if you know the answer. Okay, who's that?
Mr. Blaine. Yes.
We got to do this quickly. Good. Do you know this one? You think it's Ferrari? No. Royal Bank? Bikes. No, that's wrong. Okay, bank? No, that's wrong. So Scotland. Wrong. You guys don't know this one. Let's try Ferrari. Okay. Okay. You know this one.
NBC.
You think it's NBC? So what's interesting is you're getting these off of just smidgens. You're very good. See, you're good at this.
NBC. Merrill Lynch.
You're going to win the prize. So what's amazing is you guys may have not. So that's wrong. No.
That's a Dodge VH1.
Very good.
Bacardi.
Very good. Okay, so you guys actually didn't do very well, but you did better. You did okay. Let me just close out of that one. So we had to come up with, so that was pretty nice. We can click through it. But when you're working with little kids, first of all, we wanted to target particular brands, so we weren't using just some online thing that you could find. What we did was we sat down on the floor. We created these logo cards. We used different products. So we used 8 cigarette products. We used 4 alcohol products, 4 fast food products, 4, did I say this yet? Sugar sweetened beverages, and 4 sweets or snack candies. And what we did was we sat down with them and we created these cards. Again, every single card that we made was culturally specific to that country. And we laid them out so the kids would have to pick up one of these cards and place it next to the logo to make sure, to see if they knew what the product was for. We used international products as well as domestic products in each country, so we could look at their awareness of international products versus domestic. Let me show you some pictures. So this is a picture in India. So again, we would go to the kid's house or setting that the kid was familiar with after the consent procedure. We worked with the child. And again, what's nice about this is the kid had to physically pick up the card and put it down. There wasn't sort of any mistake of whether or not they knew it. We also had stacks of these pictures. So if there was a page of 3 things and they thought the same 3 thing, they could pick the same 3 thing for each one. So this is in India. This is in Nigeria. And okay, so that's Brazil, China, and Russia. And you can see the kids. One of the nice things about doing this was the kids could point and pick up. They did not have to be verbal. So if you had an introverted child who was not going to talk with a new researcher, they could just do a lot of this by pointing and picking up cards. Yes, yes. So one of the things was a question mark, and we explained, we actually did a couple of practice things. So we did some cars in there, and we said, you know, if you don't know what it is, that's perfectly fine. You know, you may not have ever seen this before. So we had a question mark one that they could put into all of them. But you could see, you know, the no, yes that they're pointing to, and in this one they're pointing to the pictures of the smokers versus the non-smokers. So let's get to the results. And I'm not going to do this to you. Let's start in a much easier way. So the one thing I will say, though, is we had a total sample of 2,423 kids. And we had, for every single child, we had a parent or guardian who also provided data, especially about demographics. One of the things that you'll come across when doing work with 5- and 6-year-olds is they sometimes have a hard time with demographics. They can do boy or girl usually, but not always. And if you ask them how old they are, strange things happen. So we got data also from the parents. One of the nice things that we got was we also got information about smoking in the household or tobacco use in the household. So we got information on who lived in the household and whether or not they used tobacco. So we had equal-ish samples of males and females. In some countries, for example, in India, we had more males than females. Nigeria, it was quite even. And in Brazil, we had more females than males. But in general, we were aiming for samples that were equal. We recruited door to door to door in, let me get this right, in Russia, India, Pakistan, and Nigeria. We did neighborhood sampling where we did a cluster sample and went after particular neighborhoods, and then we would go from door to door to door, finding out if there was a household with a 5- or 6-year-old, and then we'd go through the recruitment process. In China and Brazil, we did a cluster sampling through schools and preschools. So we got pretty equal samples of males and females. And we also had urban and rural samples. So we picked an urban center, and I could tell you exactly where we were for all of the different countries. But then we also had a rural sample that was around 2 to 3 hours drive from that urban center.
Did you guys collect data on socioeconomic status as well?
Yeah, we did. We were aiming for the most part for low and middle income families, though. So when we did our cluster sample, we picked neighborhoods that were low and middle income, but we collected all sorts of information from the parents on household objects, as well as parents' education and highest education achieved by any of the adults in the household. So here is the information about someone in the household using tobacco, and we had whether or not anyone in the household used tobacco, as well as whether or not the parent used tobacco. So overall, in this sample, 34%, 34.5%, had someone in the household who used tobacco, and 30% had a parent who used tobacco. And that varied tremendously, highest rates in China, lowest rates in Nigeria. What's interesting is we also, remember, we asked about whether or not the kids intended to smoke. So you could see here, I added a bar of whether or not the child intended to smoke. The highest, so overall, in this sample of 5 and 6-year-olds, when you ask them, when you grow up, will you use tobacco or will you smoke cigarettes? Again, we changed the question depending on whether or not, in India and Pakistan, we used tobacco, and cigarettes were used in other places where they don't use smokeless tobacco. But overall, 13.5% of the kids said yes, they planned to smoke when they were older. And interestingly, it was 30% in India, which exceeded whether or not someone in the household smoked. So these kids are planning on smoking regardless of whether or not someone in their own household are smoking. Also in Nigeria, kids are saying they're going to smoke even though their parents don't smoke. I thought Russia was really interesting. I'm still trying to figure out what was going on there, that it was so low. And I'm not sure just yet. It may be because things are changing there and kids are starting to get the message about tobacco products, whereas their parents don't really have that message just yet. Overall, so this is the big data. Overall, this is the percentage of children who could identify a cigarette logo, at least one cigarette logo. So 0, if you look at 0, you have somewhere around 32% of the kids, 33% of the kids can't identify any of them. But then you can see the curve looking at how many of the cigarette logos they can identify. So you have close to 67% of these kids can identify at least one cigarette logo. Again, 5 and 6-year-olds.
How did you go about selecting the cigarette logos?
So we use some international products and we use some domestic products, which is kind of really weird because most products really are defining international versus domestic in some countries was hard. But we worked with our partners in country. I've visited all of these countries at least 2 or 3 times, and I met with people who are in tobacco policy and tobacco policy control, and I worked with them to identify the different products that we should use. So we used some of the highest prevalence smoking brands there, as well as we looked at Marlboro and Camel across the board. So just to add some of the other lines, what's interesting is the light blue line is the number, the overall for the whole sample of the 2,400 kids. But when you start to look at the different countries, you see some really bizarre stuff. So I'm giving you 2 of these here. The navy blue line is Brazil, and the red line is China. So you have more in China. In our sample of over 400 kids in China, there were more kids who could name all 8 products than could name 0. In Brazil, none of the kids could name 7 or 8 of them. But they certainly can name, a good percentage of them. And this is just so you can see all of the data. these are all of the countries. So interestingly, India had the highest number that could at least do one, and then they slope down. But only China is the one that goes really up. The rest of them, once you get to 8 products, they're having trouble. So besides looking at just overall rates, we did look at what are the factors associated with the ability to identify at least one cigarette brand. And these are and I covered it up for a reason, because I think it's interesting to look at the overall sample. You see that gender's not associated when you look at the overall sample. Being older, you had a higher odds. Urban versus rural didn't matter in the overall. Someone in the household using tobacco was a significant predictor, as was knowledge of media characters. Okay? But when you pull away and look at the different countries, you start to see some really strange things. And again, we're going through the data right now. So in some countries, like Pakistan, your odds of being able to identify at least one cigarette brand is significantly lower if you're female. It's significantly higher if you're in Brazil. If you look at age, in general, being older is associated with being able to name a cigarette brand. This one I think is fascinating. Is the someone in the household someone in the household using tobacco. So for the overall sample, you have increased odds of being able to identify a cigarette brand, but it's not consistent. So in a place like India, where we saw that these kids have lots of intentions to smoke, having someone in the household wasn't predictive in this model of being able to identify a brand. Nor was it in China, where we saw really high smoking rates. So what this says to me is that they're getting their messages. Some kids are getting their messages about cigarette brands and logos from the household. Other kids are getting it from the environment. And I think you see that with the knowledge of media characters, which is their general media exposure. In China, for example, having higher media exposure was associated with being able to know more brands, whereas in some of the other countries it wasn't significant. So one other thing that we did with this project was we looked at, well, since you're already working with 5- and 6-year-olds, you might as well collect as much data as possible. So one of the things we looked at were health warnings. And we showed kids, so these are the different countries. So the top row is Brazil, China, and India. Bottom row is Nigeria, Pakistan, and Russia. We showed them current health warning labels that are on cigarette packages. And we covered up the word smoking just in case, or cigarette, or any smoking-related word, so we're covering that up. So you can see causes cancer, which is, so that top right is India, which is interesting. You know, it's in English to begin with. So something kills and something causes cancer. And we asked the kids, first of all, have you ever seen this before? And once we got that exposure, we would say, okay, well, what is this about? So here are the results from that. So we showed them 2 current labels, and overall, 62% of the kids said they had seen neither label. They didn't know about health warnings, they hadn't seen it, they weren't at all aware. 37% had seen 1 or 2 of the labels. And it varies again by country. In Nigeria, we only had, by the way, only 1 health warning because there wasn't any variation. There was only 1 health warning to see in Nigeria. But you can see it does vary by country. In Brazil, kids are more aware of these labels. And in Nigeria, they're less aware. In India, they're less aware of these labels. So once we showed them to them, we said, okay, what is this about? And we said, okay, if they come up with it's about playing in the park, that would be a 0 score. If they said it was about alcohol, that would be a 0 score. To get a score of 1, the kids had to say it's either about smoking, so that would give them a point, or they had to say it's about health or something's bad for your health or injury or something like that. To get a score of 2, they had to say smoking, had to have some sort of smoking or tobacco term as well as some negative term about health. So we see overall 62%, even when you're showing it to them, had no clue what these were about. They would come up with extraneous answers. Some 25% of them overall could come up with something when you showed it to them. And another 12% actually could put 2 and 2 together and get a score of 2 and have what we called solid understanding, at least for a 5 or 6-year-old. And again, you see variation by country. So if you think about some of the different health warnings, and here, let me go back. Whoops. You know, if you look at these, it is sometimes hard to figure out what in the world are they looking at. And by the way, we had to be extremely careful with some of these because we didn't want to be too offensive with the picture we showed. So as many of you are aware, in some countries the health warnings are extremely graphic. So we tried to pick ones that weren't too horrendous. So the Brazil one, you know, is a picture of a child at a table with cigarettes. So where does this all bring us to? So right now, we've got 2 papers out for review. Joanna and I are co-authors on them. The overall study we have out with review with pediatrics, and hopefully that'll be accepted. We'll see. The health warnings paper is out with the Journal of Public Health. Again, we're crossing our fingers. Yes, it would be great to have those papers published to show this data. But I think there's more than just publishing in scholarly journals, and so does Joanna. So one of the things that we've been doing is looking at some media advocacy. And as this is a David Jernigan definition of media advocacy, a colleague of ours, is the strategic use of mass media to support community organizers' efforts to advance social or public health policies. What we've done is based on, so we've done one of these, and it was based on the idea that there was a vote happening at the Duma, and Putin was going to be making some decisions about advertising and tobacco advertising in Russia. And we very, very quickly gathered together a crew and decided to create what we wanted to be a viral video. And I'm going to show it to you. So we worked really, really hard. We went in the middle of winter. We went right after the Christmas holiday. It was freezing cold in Moscow. I think I've only gone to Moscow when it's freezing cold. But we went to Moscow and we got together some kids. And working with a production team there and a producer that I know here, we asked a bunch of questions and we put together a video. And let's see if, and so I'm going to show it to you. If it works, if it works, if it works, if it works. Ha, it's going to work. So this is. So that's a tagged one in English just so you could actually understand it. The ones that will so okay, so here's the story. We produced these videos. I think there are two of them. There's another one that's very beautiful as well, with beautiful children talking about all sorts of things quite naturally about how bad tobacco is. We come back, we package these up as quickly as possible, editing happenings, and what happened in Russia? Do we know what happened in Russia? So the video didn't get released yet. What happened in Russia? Someone knows in this room what happened in Russia. Joanna, what happened in Russia?
The Duma passed a new law.
The Duma passed a law before we released the videos. There's we're looking at how the laws are going to be implemented, and we're thinking about releasing this when they're starting to implement them. Because one of the problems is just because there are laws out there doesn't mean there's compliance. So we're coming up with a plan to try to release these at the same time to try to garner some more support. But again, it's one thing to have data, and I think Fisher showed this in 1991, that if you have data, even from a small sample of small children, you could do a lot in tobacco policy. But I think the videos also are going to help us a lot in trying to change policy. Because once you see these pretty little kids and they're talking about smoking, I think you can change tobacco policy. And this has been a great study to work on. I highly recommend lots of you get involved with these types of things because they're fun, and I think they do make a difference. That's about it. I will stick around for questions if anyone has. Yeah.
I have a quick question. So,
Oh, I'm not supposed to.
findings were interesting, probably to be expected when you looked at recognition among kids of tobacco brands versus the health warnings. You know, the brands and the brands are designed to kind of be sticky, right?
Right.
So, do you think that your research has any implications for the way in which we currently design health warnings?
I think it does. I think if your target audience, I know the target audience for a lot of the health warnings are current smokers, but if you look at some of the international charges about this, it's actually one of the other populations that they're trying to get at are people who aren't smoking. If you're trying to reach people who are not smoking, then you need to come up with child-friendly warnings. Because the current ones are not reaching these kids. So I think you need to, especially since you have different types of warnings, and you could put different types of warnings on different types of messages or packaging, then why not create ones that will reach low literate, younger people?
So the industry has a brand that's consistent, right? And that's, I would imagine that's one of the reasons why it's sticky. But when we do health warnings on packs, we're encouraged to rotate them. And it's not necessarily, I mean, the reason you remember the brand's trademark is because there is a trademark.
Right.
It's one thing that you remember. With pack warnings, you rotate them so you get as much information out as possible and reach different.
Well, one of the things that I think is interesting is we are all very familiar, and I don't know if there's one in this room, but probably not because years have passed, but we're all very familiar with the circle with the cigarette with the line slashed through that. Why isn't that used as part of the health warning? You know, that's something, again, you're right. If you have something a logo that people are very familiar with and understand it. Now, I'm sure the tobacco industry wouldn't want that on their packaging, but you know, using very simple graphics to catch people's attention that they can understand is a much better way to go than showing a picture of a crab or a scorpion. Deborah?
Well, I think this is great. So interesting. I'm wondering whether if the purpose of the label, the
Health warning.
health warning label, is to appeal to the current smokers, this terrible thing will happen to you, right? If it is a behavioral message, these terrible things will happen to you may not be as powerful as, and I'm sure you know
Well, we do have some nice research in the States that says exactly what you're saying, is that when you do public health campaigns, reaching out to the little ones is a great idea. So there are several campaigns that have been successful, including the seatbelt ones. There was campaigns that went out to little kids and through the schools about wear your seatbelt and tell your parent to wear your seatbelt. I think there has been some work, and there's going to be more that's coming out looking at texting and driving. So little kids can patrol their parents as to whether or not they're texting and driving. There have been campaigns that try to get at kids to tell their parents to stop smoking. It's a harder one to do and has met quite a bit of resistance because parents don't want their kids telling them about that behavior for some reason. But
And can I just
yeah.
follow, because I'm interested in what you think. There was a campaign for breast cancer mammography, and it was an incredibly emotional and very, controversial, where there was a little kid who was on the steps of a school by himself, and it was, if you love me, you would get a mammogram, right? And the controversy was, what message to all the kids whose parents have breast cancer that Now, perhaps smoking is a different kind of thing. What do you think about that?
I think you have to be very careful. I think because you're going to be, if you're doing national campaigns to reach kids, you really have to be very careful about different populations that you're reaching. What's very nice is these days you can target your media very specifically to target audiences. So you don't always have to do national campaigns. You could do very targeted campaigns. So for example, there are very high smoking rates in Baltimore. And you could do targeted campaigns to children in Baltimore that might work better than trying to just do a national campaign to children. And I think that's where you start to actually narrow in on your target audience. It matters very much if you're trying to reach 5- and 6-year-olds versus 15- and 16-year-olds. So.
I like the whole viral video concept. That's a big thing now, YouTube and all that kind of stuff. But the police and the parents, I agree with that. It doesn't have to be a national thing. Like my daughter's 3 and they taught her the traffic light.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter where you're going. She's slow down, stop. You can go now. You gotta finish the race. So in her mind, driving is a race.
Wait until she could read your speedometer.
So I agree with that, that maybe a plea to the children, to put the children on, especially with these new CDC commercials that are out that are very straightforward with the people who have voice boxes.
Mhm.
There's one that I cried on where a woman said that record yourself reading a book now before, because she said her grandchild, the only voice he's ever heard is this one, so that one kind of plays on the strings a little bit. And also what Mark was saying, to use the symbols that we're used to. When I was growing up, it was just say no.
Mm-hmm.
That was what was big. I mean, if you had that on a package that says just say no, I think that would be just as strong as having a lung up there that's beat up and black.
Well, that's why one of the reasons why I did the logo quiz with you is you can recognize even a piece of that logo and know what that product is, and it evokes your knowledge of that product as well as your attitudes about the products. And even just a small recognizable piece can really play on what you're thinking about. And we see that with small children. So there's lots of reasons to try to target health messages to the youngest kids out there.
Do you have any plans to possibly, I know that the Russia video you did expressly because of the law, but do you have any thoughts that you might try and do it anywhere else?
We are showing this around and hoping that there'll be other places where we might do some more videos. But if not this, the next thing, and it's going to be important to follow what types of media are out there. Right now, viral videos are hot, but just keeping your finger on the pulse of what's popular and what works is really important. So yes, I would love to do more viral videos if we do them soon. I'm not sure if that's going to work 5 years from now. It might be something completely different.
Just a comment and then a question. So, of course, following up on your point, Dina, that the logos are so powerful. So what tobacco control tries to do is reduce advertising and promotion of the product. And so in many countries, they pass complete comprehensive advertising bans. You can't advertise. You can't promote the product. And now in Australia, and it will happen elsewhere, you can't even have a logo on the pack of cigarettes. So that's where it sort of shows you have to deal with these very powerful symbols, and we're getting there.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing. So my question was, so what did you find that was particularly exciting or unexpected for the other types of products you looked at?
I have targeted my attention to doing the tobacco products first so we could get those papers out the door. We're starting to see very high awareness of the other things. I think one of the ones that I'm very happy that I collected data on is the fast food thing. Because we know, for example, 50% of small Chinese boys are now obese. And there's no big surprise that those kids can recognize KFC and McDonald's logos, and I think understanding the fast foods and the sugar-sweetened beverages is the next one. We're starting to look at the alcohol as well, but I think it's the fast food and the sugar-sweetened beverages that's going to be, you can, and I'm sure most of you know this, you can go to the most remote places in the world and still find Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola logos painted on the sides of people's houses.
You can go south and see that.
Yeah. Well, but it's amazing when you go into some very remote places. Those logos are out there, and they're attracting, global markets. But
Great. Well, Dina, thanks so much for sharing
problem.
this with us.
I do. I could get to it. I could probably get.
We'll just take 2 minutes because we have a couple minutes just to show you the other video because it gives a similar but slightly different flavor of what the kids are thinking about.
If it's working. Let's try 3. And they were all beautiful. And that was by chance, by the way. Okay, wait. Sorry, let me go back to one that has subtitles. Or not. Let's try 2. Yeah, it might be. Yeah, it's English. And yeah, it might work. Give it a second. Or not. It might not work.
Okay, well, next time, stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
We will soon have them on the IDTC YouTube channel as well. But, yeah.
Okay.
Once they're released, I'm not sure. Okay, well,